After 25 years of caring for her husband, Clara Anderson has given up everything, her dreams, career, even her own identity, to be his full-time caregiver. But when subtle clues lead her to suspect something is off, Clara makes a shocking discovery that turns her world upside down. What if the life she sacrificed for was built on deception? This is the story of Clara's powerful journey from betrayal to self-discovery, where she learns to reclaim her life and find new purpose. If Clara's story inspires you, make sure to subscribe for more unforgettable journeys and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Now let's dive into this incredible story. In today's story, we follow Grace Davenport, a single mother who stumbles upon a mysterious envelope filled with cash in an unlikely place, the town junkyard. It seems like a miracle, a lifeline for Grace and her 2 young children. But with this discovery comes a dark twist. As threats begin to shadow their every step, Grace finds herself caught between protecting her family and confronting a powerful web of corruption that reaches deep into her own community. What would you do if your luck turned into a dangerous secret? Join Grace as she faces betrayal, an unexpected alliance, and a choice that could change everything. If you're ready for a journey of courage and resilience, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. What would you do in Grace's shoes? Now let's dive into the story. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, fading light over the town's junkyard. Rows of discarded furniture, broken-down cars, and rusting metal parts spread out before Grace Davenport like a forgotten graveyard of other people's lives. She tightened her worn coat around herself as a chilly wind swept through, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. It was late October, and the air held a sharpness that promised winter's arrival soon. Grace moved with a practiced efficiency, her hands digging through piles, lifting objects, and testing their weight or worth with a discerning eye. This had become her routine, a life she'd fallen into after her husband Matthew passed away 2 years prior. Each day was a new struggle to keep her children, Samuel and Ella, fed and warm. Each month a fresh reminder of her dwindling finances. Grace knew every corner of this junkyard, every stack of forgotten items, every place where she might find something worth a few dollars at the local pawn shop or flea market. "Samuel, keep an eye on your sister, please," she called over her shoulder. Samuel, her 10-year-old with his father's serious brown eyes, nodded solemnly. "Come on, Ella," he said, gently tugging his 8-year-old sister's hand. Ella, too young to fully understand the weight of their mother's struggles, hopped along with him, her small feet crunching over bits of broken glass and gravel. "Look, Mama," Ella chirped, holding up a dented toy car she'd found. Grace offered her daughter a warm smile, grateful for her children's innocence amid such harsh realities. She gave Ella a nod of approval, and the little girl clutched the toy proudly, adding it to her own modest collection of treasures from the junkyard. Grace returned to her search, her hands aching from the cold as she pushed aside pieces of old furniture, stacks of rusting scrap metal, and piles of plastic bags. She could feel her hope waning with each item she examined and tossed aside. A broken lamp, a chipped ceramic dishes. None of it would bring in much, certainly not enough to feed her children for more than a day or two. The light was fading quickly now, and a chill crept into her bones as she pulled her coat tighter. She knew she should head back soon, but a stubborn determination kept her rooted in place, her fingers working through the rubble with renewed urgency. Just one more thing, she thought. Just one small stroke of luck. Then her hand brushed against something unusual. She froze, her fingers wrapping around a strange, thick material. Frowning, she gave it a tug, revealing the corner of a finely woven carpet. A luxurious one, by the feel of it. Intrigued, she pulled it out further, surprised by the weight and quality of the fabric. The rug was thick and soft, nothing like the cheap scraps that usually ended up here. "This can't be right," she murmured to herself, glancing around as if someone might suddenly appear to take it back. She tugged the carpet all the way out, marveling at its intricate patterns and deep colors. It looked almost new, out of place in the junkyard's grime and decay. As she unrolled it, her heart skipped a beat. A thick envelope tumbled out, landing at her feet. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the envelope, her mind racing with possibilities, with a dangerous mixture of hope and fear. Kneeling down, she picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands. With trembling fingers, she opened the flap and gasped. The envelope was packed with crisp $100 bills, more money than she'd seen in her entire life. This can't be real," she whispered, glancing around as though someone might be watching her. She counted a few bills, trying to process the sight of so much money. The thought of what it could do for her children, warm clothes, food on the table, a month or two without the constant anxiety of rent, flooded her mind, and a tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "Mama?" Ella's voice snapped her back to reality. She quickly stuffed the envelope into her coat pocket and turned to face her children, her expression as calm as she could manage. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she replied, her voice barely steady. "Just an old carpet. Thought it might be nice for our living room." Samuel eyed her with a seriousness that belied his young age. "That carpet looks expensive, Mom." Grace smiled at him, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "Maybe it is, but let's get it home first, all right?" They gathered their things, Grace rolling up the carpet with a cautious eye on the fading light. As they walked toward the edge of the junkyard, she felt a prickling at the back of her neck, as though someone were watching them. She stopped, turning slowly, and squinted into the shadows. For a brief moment she thought she saw a figure standing near a pile of old metal, its silhouette blending into the gloom. "Who's that?" Samuel asked, his voice low. "I don't know," she replied softly, gripping his hand tightly. "But let's go home." Their home, a small dilapidated shack at the edge of town, was a far cry from the comfort Grace once knew. The roof leaked when it rained. The walls were thin enough to let the cold seep in during winter, and the floor creaked with every step. But to Grace, it was a haven, a place where she could keep her children close and do her best to shield them from the hardships they faced. Once they were inside, Grace locked the door and placed the carpet in the corner. She felt a mixture of awe and fear as she took out the envelope and opened it again. The crisp bills seemed almost surreal in the dim light, a striking contrast to the peeling wallpaper and worn-out furniture of her tiny home. "How much is it, Mom?" Samuel asked, his eyes wide as he peered over her shoulder. Grace quickly folded the envelope shut. "Enough to buy food and clothes, maybe even pay the rent for a few months," she said, keeping her voice calm. But in her mind, the possibilities unfurled like the pages of a story she'd long forgotten. A future without worry, a life where her children could grow up without the constant weight of poverty pressing down on them. "Why would someone throw away that much money?" Samuel asked, frowning in confusion. "That's the thing, honey," she replied softly. "I don't think it was meant to be thrown away." She glanced at the door, a cold shiver creeping up her spine as she remembered the shadowy figure from the junkyard. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching her, that whoever owned this money might not be the type to give it up willingly. After tucking the children into bed, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope as she wrestled with her conscience. She knew what the money could mean for her children, a way out of the endless cycle of poverty, a chance for a fresh start. But she also knew the risks, the possibility that this money was connected to something dangerous, something that could bring harm to her family. With a sigh, she got up and hid the envelope in an old box under her bed. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind churning with worry and doubt. In the morning, she decided there was only one place she could turn for advice. She would take the money to the police. The next morning, after dropping Samuel and Ella off with a trusted neighbor, Grace made her way to the local police station, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The station was small, just a few rooms with faded paint and flickering fluorescent lights. But it was the heart of law and order in their little town. She was greeted by Officer David Barnes, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calming presence. David had been a police officer in town for years, well known for his efforts to help struggling families. He listened attentively as Grace explained her situation, his expression growing more serious as she handed him the envelope. "You're saying you found this in the junkyard?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "And there was someone watching us. I thought it was best to bring it here." David nodded, his gaze shifting to the envelope as he weighed his next words carefully. "You did the right thing, Grace. But you should know that people who leave money like this, they don't usually want it found." Whoever was watching you might not be happy that it's here now. A wave of fear washed over her as she considered his words.
Do you think we're in danger?
David met her gaze, his expression firm. I'll keep an eye on things. But Grace, be careful. Watch your children, keep your doors locked, and if you see anything unusual, you come to me right away. Grace nodded, her heart pounding as she left the station. She had hoped for reassurance, but instead, David's words only heightened her sense of unease. She felt like a thread dangling over a chasm, unsure if she was safe or if danger was lurking just out of sight. As she walked back to her shack, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the junkyard. But the street was empty, save for the occasional stray dog and the gentle sway of branches in the autumn breeze. She quickened her pace, eager to return home, to the safety of her children's arms. By late afternoon, Grace had returned home, her mind still tangled in a knot of anxiety. She busied herself with household chores, hoping the distraction might ease her tension. Samuel and Ella were playing by the window, their laughter and chatter a small comfort in the silence that hung heavily around her. A loud knock at the door made her jump. She quickly moved to hush her children, a feeling of dread sinking into her stomach. She rarely had visitors, and her neighbors tended to keep to themselves. She opened the door a crack, peering out. No one was there. Frowning, she glanced around, seeing nothing but an empty street. But as she stepped out onto the porch, her gaze fell upon a small white envelope on the ground, just at the base of the steps. She hesitated, a chill running through her as she bent down to pick it up. Back inside, with trembling hands, she opened the envelope. A single sheet of paper fell out, and she unfolded it carefully. Written in dark, hasty letters was a short message. Return what isn't yours. This is your first and only warning. Grace's heart pounded as she stared at the note. She knew immediately that this was about the money. She could feel the ominous weight of the words sinking in, pressing down on her chest. For a moment she felt frozen, the implications of her actions now fully sinking in.
Mama, what's that?
Samuel's voice brought her back to the present. She quickly folded the note, forcing a small smile. Just something from a friend, she said, slipping the paper into her pocket. But Samuel's curious gaze lingered, and Grace saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. That evening, after putting her children to bed, Grace sat at her small kitchen table staring at the crumpled note. Her thoughts raced, memories of her husband's reassuring words echoing in her mind. Matthew had always told her to trust her instincts, to protect their family at all costs. She missed his wisdom and his quiet strength, feeling his absence more deeply than ever. With a sigh, she reached for her phone and dialed the number of her closest friend, Emily Foster. Emily had been her confidant for years, a steady presence who had seen her through the darkest days after Matthew's death. "Grace? It's late. Is everything all right?" Emily's voice was warm and steady, a balm to Grace's frayed nerves. "No," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something strange happened. I don't know if I should be worried, but I thought I'd let you know." She went on to explain the events of the past few days, the money she'd found, the warning from the stranger, the envelope on her doorstep. As she spoke, she could almost hear Emily's face grow more serious. "Grace," Emily said, her tone somber, "I know times are hard, but maybe it's best to keep quiet about this money. Whoever left that note clearly knows you found it, and if they're desperate enough to leave a threat, well, I wouldn't underestimate them." Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I thought I was doing the right thing, taking it to the police. But now I feel like I've put my children in danger." "Maybe you did the right thing," Emily replied, "but you need to stay careful. If you see anything suspicious, you call me right away. I'll be there as fast as I can." Grace nodded, though she knew Emily couldn't see her. Just hearing her friend's steady voice helped to ease some of her fear. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without you. Just take care, Grace. And remember, you're stronger than you think." The next morning, as Grace walked Samuel and Ella to school, she could feel eyes following her from the houses they passed. Some neighbors looked out through their windows, peering curiously, while others on the street nodded stiffly before quickly averting their gaze. It was as if the whole town had caught wind of her find, and the once friendly community seemed to shift around her, growing colder, more watchful. As they approached the school gates, Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor with a reputation for gossip, approached with a knowing smile.
Grace,
She began, her tone dripping with feigned concern. I heard you've come into a bit of luck lately. Found something valuable, did you? Grace's face tightened as she realized what Mrs. Jenkins was hinting at. I don't know what you mean, she replied, forcing herself to sound calm. Mrs. Jenkins pursed her lips. Oh, come now, Grace. Everyone knows. Word travels fast in a small town like ours. People are wondering where it came from, that's all. Grace felt a flash of irritation, but she kept her voice even. I'd appreciate it if people kept their curiosity to themselves, she said. It's a private matter. But as she turned away, she could feel Mrs. Jenkins's gaze still on her, and she knew that rumors would only continue to grow. As she walked back home, she clenched her hands into fists, fighting back the frustration and fear building inside her. She wanted to shield her children from the whispers, to give them a semblance of normalcy in the midst of this strange situation. But the more she tried to keep things calm, the more the town seemed to close in on her, like a net tightening around her and her family. That night, Grace lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of her small house as the wind howled outside. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, every sound heightened by her own sense of unease. She kept replaying the day's events in her mind. The stairs, Mrs. Jenkins's probing questions, the creeping feeling that her life was no longer her own. Suddenly, she heard a soft tap on the window. She sat up, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. Another tap, faint but deliberate, echoed through the room. She tiptoed out of bed, wrapping her robe tightly around herself as she moved toward the window, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. Peeking out through the curtains, she saw nothing but the dim outline of her yard, bathed in moonlight. Yet the sense of being watched was undeniable. A chill ran through her, and she quickly drew the curtains shut, retreating to her bed and wrapping her arms around herself, as if she could ward off the fear tightening around her. Grace lay there, wide-eyed and alert, waiting for the dawn to come and break the spell of the night. She made a silent promise to herself, to protect her children no matter what. But as the hours dragged on, she knew that the decision to report the money had set something in motion, something she could no longer control. With the weight of the previous night's fear still heavy on her, Grace returned to the police station the next day, determined to find a solution to the growing threats against her family. She waited anxiously in the lobby, watching Officer David Barnes as he stepped out of his office, his expression growing serious as he spotted her. "Grace?" he greeted, motioning for her to follow him into a private room. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon."
has something else happened?
Grace handed him the crumpled note, her voice unsteady as she explained the eerie tap at her window the night before. David's face grew tense as he read the message, his brows furrowing in concern. "This is more serious than I thought," he said. "Whoever is behind this clearly doesn't want you or anyone else to have that money. But don't worry, we'll keep a close watch on you and your children." Grace looked at him, her eyes pleading. "David, I don't know if I did the right thing. I only wanted to protect my family, but now I don't know if they're safe." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Grace, you did the right thing. You showed integrity even when it wasn't easy. But you have to be vigilant. If anything feels wrong, no matter how small, let me know." Grace nodded, feeling a renewed sense of strength, though the fear still lingered. She left the station with a determination to face whatever came next, hoping that her trust in David would be enough to shield her family from the dangers creeping closer. Returning home that evening, Grace found herself haunted by questions she couldn't escape. She knew the money must have come from somewhere, some place or person, with enough power to leave threats and spread fear without consequence. She thought of her children, of their futures, and the risk of losing everything if she didn't protect them. After putting Samuel and Ella to bed, Grace sat alone in the quiet darkness of the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She wondered who could have left the money in the junkyard, and why it had been wrapped so carefully, almost as if it were a trap. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, she closed the blinds, checking the locks on every door and window before heading to bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she whispered a silent prayer for strength, clinging to the hope that somehow she could protect her children from whatever was lurking in the shadows. The following days passed in a haze of tension for Grace. She felt as if every corner of her life was under a spotlight, each glance from her neighbors charged with unspoken questions. She tried to keep her routine normal, but even simple tasks, walking Samuel and Ella to school, picking up groceries, returning to the house after dark, had taken on a sinister edge. At the grocery store one evening, she noticed a man lingering at the end of the aisle. He was dressed in dark clothes, blending in with the late shoppers, but his gaze was fixed on her with a piercing intensity that made her skin prickle. When she shifted aisles, he followed, never speaking, never coming closer, but always watching. Her pulse quickened as she hurried through checkout, her eyes darting around for any sign of familiar faces. But everyone seemed wrapped up in their own world. As she reached her car, she dared one last look back, and her stomach dropped. The man was there, standing by the store's entrance, his eyes still locked on her. Grace quickly unlocked the car and climbed in, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the ignition. She drove home as fast as she could, her mind racing, thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. Had it been a coincidence? Or was this another warning, another reminder that someone was watching her every move? When she reached her house, she bolted the door and checked every window, the shadow of the stranger's gaze lingering in her mind. Samuel, noticing her anxiety, approached her cautiously. "Mom?" he asked, his voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Are you okay?" Grace forced a smile, though she knew it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." But Samuel didn't seem convinced, and she couldn't blame him. The tension in the house was thick, an unspoken fear that hung between them like a storm cloud, ready to burst. As the days dragged on, Samuel grew more observant of his mother's anxiety. Grace tried her best to mask her fear, to keep her children's lives as normal as possible, but Samuel's serious gaze often lingered on her, watching, analyzing. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, he came into the kitchen, his face drawn with worry. "Mom, what's really going on?" he asked quietly. "I know something's wrong." Grace paused, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. She knelt down to his level, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "There are just some grown-up problems, honey, but I promise, everything's going to be okay." "But who was that man watching us at the store?" Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper, his face pale as he looked up at her. "I saw him too. He looked mean." Grace's heart sank. She wanted to shield her children from the dangers lurking around them, but Samuel was too perceptive to be comforted by simple reassurances. She forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to summon the same calm she used to see in her husband. "Samuel, I don't know who that man was," she admitted, her voice steady. "But I need you to be brave for me. If anything ever feels wrong, you stay close to me, all right?" He nodded solemnly, his small hand reaching out to squeeze hers. In that moment, Grace felt a swell of pride for her son, for his strength and maturity, but her heart ached knowing he had to carry such a burden. The note appeared the next day, taped to her front door. Unlike the previous messages, this one was bolder, the letters larger and more ominous. "This is your last warning. Keep silent or pay the price." Grace's fingers trembled as she pulled the note down, her mind racing. Each message had grown more direct, more threatening, and the weight of their words pressed down on her like a vice. She knew she couldn't go to Officer Barnes again without risking a new confrontation. She could feel her options narrowing, the walls closing in around her. As she stood in the doorway trying to gather her thoughts, Ella came running up behind her, her cheerful chatter a brief comfort. "What's that, Mama?" Ella asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Grace quickly folded the note, slipping it into her pocket. "Just something for Mommy to take care of," she replied, forcing a smile. "Why don't you go play with your brother?" Ella nodded, running off happily. But Grace's mind remained troubled. She was no longer sure if her home was a place of safety or a trap waiting to be sprung. That evening, she spent hours checking the locks, moving the children's beds away from the windows, and keeping every light in the house on. She slept fitfully, waking at every creak and groan of the house, her heart pounding each time, convinced that danger was lurking just outside. Desperation finally drove Grace to visit Officer David Barnes again. Despite her fears of further escalation, she found him outside the police station, deep in conversation with a few fellow officers. When he noticed her, he broke away from the group, his expression shifting to one of concern. "Grace?" he greeted, his voice low and calm. "What brings you back?" She took a deep breath, handing him the latest note. "They're watching me, David. Whoever left this, they're getting closer, and I don't know how much longer I can keep my children safe." David read the note, his jaw tightening as he glanced back at her. "Grace, I think it's time we take some additional precautions. If they're this intent on keeping you quiet, we need to approach this carefully. I'll get in touch with a federal agent who specializes in these cases. She can help us keep an eye on things without drawing too much attention." Relief washed over Grace as David explained the plan. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "I just want my children to be safe." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure of it, Grace. You've done the right thing, and you're not alone in this." The next day, David introduced Grace to Agent Kate Monroe, a seasoned federal agent with a firm handshake and a no-nonsense demeanor. Kate's calm confidence was immediately reassuring, and Grace felt some of her anxiety lift as the agent laid out her plan. "Grace, I'll be honest," Kate began, her voice steady and clear. "Whoever left that money isn't someone who plays by the rules. But the fact that you came forward gives us a strong advantage. If we handle this carefully, we can protect you and your family while building a case against them." Grace nodded, absorbing Kate's words, feeling a glimmer of hope. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, stay vigilant. If you see anyone suspicious, take note. And if you can, avoid going out alone." Kate's gaze softened. "I know this is hard, but you're showing incredible courage. We'll be here every step of the way." For the first time in days, Grace felt a renewed sense of determination. She thanked Kate, her mind focused on the next steps. With the support of both David and Kate, she felt that perhaps she could finally find a way to protect her children without surrendering to fear. For the next few days, Grace did her best to keep her family's life as normal as possible. She made pancakes for breakfast, played card games with Samuel and Ella, and spent evenings reading them their favorite bedtime stories. She held on to these small moments of joy like lifelines, using them to push back the shadows of fear that lingered in her mind. One quiet evening, as she sat by the window, she watched Samuel and Ella playing in the yard. The sound of their laughter drifted through the open window, mingling with the faint scent of autumn leaves. She closed her eyes, savoring the peace, grateful for the brief respite. For a moment, everything felt right. She could almost believe that the threats, the warnings, the sense of being watched, they were all just figments of her imagination. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, she knew that peace was fragile, and that her family's safety was something she would have to fight for. Late one night, as Grace was preparing to lock up, she heard the faint rumble of a car outside. She peered through the blinds, heart pounding as she saw a black sedan parked across the street. The car sat there, idle and silent, its headlights casting an eerie glow over the empty road. After what felt like an eternity, the car's engine roared to life, and it slowly rolled forward, stopping directly in front of her house. A figure inside the car raised a hand, gesturing toward her before the car sped off into the night. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She turned away from the window, hands shaking as she locked the door and leaned against it, her mind reeling with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And how much longer could she keep this up? The next morning, Grace sat down with Samuel, sensing that he had already picked up on the tension. She gently took his hands, meeting his serious gaze. "Samuel, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she began. "There are people who don't want us talking about the money I found. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I need you to stay close to me, and if you ever feel unsafe, you tell me right away." Samuel nodded, his face set with a determination far beyond his years. "I will, Mom. I'll protect Ella, too." Grace's heart ached with pride and sadness. She hated that her son had to carry such a heavy burden, but his courage gave her strength. "We're going to get through this," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, As Grace sat alone in the darkened living room, she felt the weight of all she had sacrificed, all she had risked. The house was silent, save for the gentle ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Suddenly, a noise outside jolted her from her thoughts. A soft scraping sound like someone moving outside her window. Her heart raced as she moved to the edge of the curtain, peering out carefully. There, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing just beyond the yard, watching her house. Fear gripped her, but she held her breath, refusing to let it take over. She knew that whoever was out there was watching, waiting for her to break. But she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Not now, not ever. As dawn broke, she sat resolute, knowing that the stakes had risen. But so had her resolve. She was ready to face whatever came next, to protect her family at all costs. The night was quiet, an almost unsettling stillness pressing down on Grace's small home. Every light was off, and the house was cloaked in darkness, save for the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains. She had just tucked Samuel and Ella into bed, leaving their doors slightly ajar to hear them should they need her. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house were the only sounds keeping her grounded. Suddenly a noise shattered the silence, a faint, deliberate knock at the front door. Grace froze, every nerve in her body on edge. She held her breath, her mind racing through 1,000 scenarios as she debated what to do. The knock came again, louder this time. She moved toward the front door, careful not to make a sound. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a tall figure standing on her porch, their face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Grace!" the voice called, calm and steady. "I know you're in there. Open up, or we'll have a problem." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She quickly backed away from the door, heading straight for the children's room. She gently woke them, pressing a finger to her lips to signal silence. "Come with me, quietly," she whispered, ushering them toward the back of the house. They crept into the small utility closet near the kitchen, where she crouched down beside them, pulling them close. "Mom, what's going on?" Samuel whispered, his voice trembling. "Shh," she replied softly, hugging him tight. "Just stay with me, okay?" The pounding at the door grew louder, more insistent. Her mind raced through her options, but there were few. She couldn't call David without risking the intruder hearing her. All she could do was wait, hope, and stay hidden until the person outside decided to leave. The minutes dragged by like hours. The children huddled close, their breathing shallow and quick, mirroring her own fear. Grace kept one hand on the door handle, prepared to hold it shut if anyone tried to get in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking ceased. Silence returned, and Grace let out a shaky breath, holding her children close until she was sure they were safe. At dawn, with her children still asleep, Grace slipped outside and headed straight to the police station. She couldn't keep running from these shadows without help. She needed someone who would take her seriously, someone she could trust, and she knew that David Barnes was the only person who would believe her. David's face grew tight with concern as she described the events of the night before. "This isn't a coincidence, Grace. They know where you are, and they're trying to intimidate you." "But you're not alone in this," he assured her, his voice steady. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of her exhaustion settling on her shoulders. "David, I'm so tired. I just want my children to be safe. That's all that matters to me." David glanced around the station, his expression thoughtful. "Then we need to take this a step further. I'll arrange for Agent Kate Monroe to bring you to a safe location until we can figure out a permanent solution. It's a temporary step, but it'll buy us time." Grace took a deep breath, grateful but still wary. "All right. If you think it's the best option, I trust you, David." As she left the station, Grace felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps there was a way to protect her family, a way to find a safe place where they could start over, without the fear that had been shadowing them for so long. Later that evening, Agent Kate Monroe arrived at Grace's house with an unmarked SUV and a steely resolve. Grace quickly gathered their essentials, guiding Samuel and Ella to the car with whispered reassurances. They clung to her, sensing the tension in the air, but Grace did her best to keep them calm. "Where are we going, Mom?" Samuel asked, his voice small. "To a safe place," Grace replied, squeezing his hand. "It's just for a little while." As they drove out of town, The landscape shifted from the familiar streets and houses to the winding roads that led into the countryside. Fields stretched out on either side of them, endless and quiet, until they reached a secluded cabin nestled among tall pines, far removed from any nearby town. Kate helped them settle in, showing Grace how to use the security system and promising that an officer would check on them daily.
"This is just a precaution,"
she said, her voice calm. "You'll be safe here until we get things under control." Grace nodded, grateful for the respite, but uneasy with the knowledge that their safety was still uncertain. As she looked out at the quiet forest surrounding the cabin, she hoped this peace would last. In the days that followed, Grace found herself slowly unwinding, savoring the quiet moments with her children. The cabin was simple but cozy, its walls lined with warm wood and its windows offering a view of the surrounding trees. Samuel and Ella adapted quickly, turning the unfamiliar space into a playground of exploration and laughter. They spent afternoons walking the trails that wound through the forest, discovering wildflowers and streams, and playing hide-and-seek among the trees. Grace found herself smiling, even laughing, as she watched her children's carefree joy. At night, however, the shadows seemed darker, the silence more foreboding. Despite the cabin's charm, a part of her remained vigilant, always listening, always waiting for the calm to break. One night, as she lay awake listening to the rustle of leaves outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was temporary, that the storm was still coming, and that it would be fiercer than before. The storm arrived 2 weeks later, not as a force of nature, but as a calculated betrayal. Grace was cooking breakfast when a knock sounded at the door. She froze, her heart pounding, but quickly relaxed when she recognized the voice outside. It was Officer David Barnes. She opened the door, relief flooding her as she saw his familiar face.
"David,"
she began,
"I didn't expect to see you out here."
"I had to check on you," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door.
"There's been a development, something we need to discuss."
But before she could ask any questions, David's expression shifted, and a pair of men stepped in behind him, their faces cold and unfriendly.
"David?"
Grace's voice wavered, confusion and fear twisting her gut. David's gaze dropped, avoiding her eyes.
"I'm sorry, Grace. I didn't want it to come to this."
The men approached her, one pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Grace stumbled back, heart racing as she realized what was happening. She had been betrayed.
"No,
please," she whispered. But her pleas were met with silence. As the men moved in to restrain her, Grace felt the weight of her trust, her hope, and her desperation collapsing around her. She fought to keep calm, knowing her children were still safe in the other room. All she could do was try to shield them from the horror unfolding in front of them. As the men forced her outside, Grace's mind raced. She couldn't let her children see her like this, couldn't let them suffer for the choices she had made. She cast a quick glance back toward the cabin, her mind working desperately to find a way out. But just as they reached the SUV, a second vehicle sped into the driveway. The door flew open, and Agent Kate Monroe jumped out, her expression a mixture of fury and determination.
"Let her go!"
Kate's voice rang out, authoritative and unyielding. The men froze, exchanging wary glances, but David's voice cut through the tension, his tone cold.
"Kate,
this is none of your business."
"On the contrary,"
Kate replied, stepping forward.
"This is exactly my business."
"You've crossed the line, Barnes." With a sudden, well-practiced movement, Kate drew her weapon, her eyes locked on the men holding Grace. They reluctantly released her, stepping back with raised hands. Grace stumbled, quickly moving behind Kate, her heart racing as the two men retreated.
"Get in the car, Grace,"
Kate ordered, her voice calm but urgent. Grace didn't hesitate, climbing into Kate's SUV as Samuel and Ella rushed to her side, clinging to her with tears in their eyes. Kate backed them out of the driveway, leaving the cabin and its hidden dangers behind as they sped down the road. Grace held her children tightly, whispering words of comfort, grateful beyond measure for the intervention that had saved them. As they left the cabin far behind, Grace felt a renewed sense of resolve. The betrayal, the fear, the narrow escape. They had all strengthened her determination to see this through. She knew now that she couldn't just hide from the threats that shadowed her family. She had to stand up, to fight, not only for herself, but for Samuel and Ella. Kate glanced at her, a glint of respect in her eyes. "Grace, I'm sorry you had to go through that, but we're in this together now. We're going to take these people down." Grace met her gaze, her own resolve clear. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep my children safe, no matter the cost." The drive back into town was long, the silence heavy, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was a silence of preparation, of readiness. They would face the storm head-on, together, and Grace knew in her heart that she was finally ready. Back in town, Grace and Agent Kate Monroe devised a plan to bring down the corrupt forces that had infiltrated her life. They worked in secrecy, using Kate's contacts within the federal agency to avoid any further leaks that could put Grace and her family at risk. Kate outlined a risky but effective strategy. Lure the main players into a meeting under the guise of Grace's surrender. "Grace, they want you silenced," Kate said one evening, her tone serious. "But if we can get them all in one place, we can gather enough evidence to make arrests. We'll have surveillance set up, and I'll be there the entire time." Grace's heart raced at the thought of facing these men again, but she knew that this was the only way to protect her children. She couldn't spend the rest of her life running, and she was tired of hiding. She took a deep breath, steadying her resolve. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I'm ready." They arranged the meeting for the following night at an abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of town, a place where the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing secrets whole. It was a fitting setting for the reckoning that was to come. The warehouse was cold and dark, the sound of dripping water echoing through the vast emptiness. Grace waited inside, her hands clenched tightly in her coat pockets, trying to steady her nerves. She knew that Kate and her team were close, watching from hidden positions, ready to move in at her signal. She just had to hold her ground. The first to arrive was David Barnes. He stepped out of a black SUV, his face shadowed but unmistakable in the dim light. He wore a grim expression, his eyes scanning the warehouse before they landed on Grace. "Grace," he called out, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. "You really thought you could go against us?" She stood tall, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "You forced my hand, David. I did what I had to do." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Brave words. But they won't save you now." Just then, another figure emerged from the shadows. Grace's stomach twisted as she recognized Nick Darrow, Martin Cole's trusted enforcer. His presence was a chilling reminder of the power these men wielded. The two men exchanged glances before turning their attention back to Grace. "Let's get this over with," Darrow muttered, pulling out a small device that looked like a voice recorder. He nodded at David, who pulled out a pen and paper, setting up as if to take notes. Grace took a shaky breath. "So that's how this works? You just record my surrender and think that erases everything you've done?" David's smirk faltered, and he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to say exactly what we tell you to. No more surprises." Grace nodded, her gaze steely. She knew Kate was listening, waiting for her signal. "All right," she replied calmly, "but let me tell you something first." The men exchanged uneasy glances as Grace began to speak, her voice steady and clear, recounting every threat, every piece of evidence she'd collected with Kate's help. She made it clear she wasn't afraid, that she had a way out, and that justice was coming. "Enough!" David snapped, cutting her off. He reached for her arm, but in that moment a sharp click echoed through the warehouse, followed by a voice over the intercom. "This is the FBI. Stand down!" David's face paled as Kate and her team stepped out from behind the hidden surveillance equipment, their weapons trained on him and Darrow. They both raised their hands reluctantly, their expressions twisted with rage and defeat. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief washing over her as Kate approached, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," Kate whispered. Grace nodded, her eyes never leaving David's. For good this time. The hours following the arrest were a blur. Statements, interviews, paperwork. It all seemed surreal. Grace sat in a small room at the station, her mind processing everything she had been through. The fear, the betrayal, the sacrifices. But beneath it all, a sense of peace began to settle. Kate entered the room, a small smile on her face. "They're going to be held without bail," With the evidence we gathered, they won't be a threat anymore. You're finally free, Grace. The words hit her like a warm wave, soothing away the last remnants of doubt and fear. She was free. Her children were safe. She could finally breathe without the constant weight of danger pressing down on her. "Thank you, Kate," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Kate's smile softened. "You did the hard part. You stood up when it mattered most." Grace returned home that night, exhausted but hopeful. She walked into her children's room watching them sleep, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had fought for them, had given everything to keep them safe, and now, at last, she could give them the life they deserved. The next morning, Grace woke to the first rays of sunlight filtering through her window. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence she hadn't felt in months. She allowed herself a moment to savor it, to let the warmth seep into her bones. She spent the day with her children, taking them to their favorite park, laughing with them as they chased each other through the fields. She watched Samuel and Ella with a sense of wonder, marveling at their resilience, their joy. She had almost lost everything, but now, with the shadows gone, they had a chance to start anew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was finally free from the fear that had haunted her, free to give her children the safe, loving home they deserved. In the weeks that followed, the arrests of David Barnes, Nick Darrow, and their associates made headlines. Grace's story spread, inspiring others in the town to speak up against corruption and stand up for justice. The community rallied around her, offering support and admiration for her courage. The police department underwent a massive restructuring, with Kate leading the charge to implement reforms that would prevent future corruption. Her efforts turned the town into a model of transparency and integrity, a place where people no longer feared the power of the few. Grace found herself at the center of these changes, a symbol of resilience and integrity. She was often invited to speak at town meetings, sharing her story and reminding others that standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, could make a difference. One evening, she was invited to an award ceremony, where the mayor presented her with a Medal of Courage. Standing in front of the gathered crowd, Grace felt a mixture of humility and pride. She accepted the award with a simple message. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are. The crowd erupted in applause, and as Grace looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for her family, for her community, and for herself, and she had won. 5 years later, Grace's life had settled into a steady rhythm. Samuel and Ella were thriving in school, their laughter filling the house with joy. They had a new home, one filled with light and love, far from the shadows of the past. Grace herself had found purpose in community work, helping other single parents and families in need, guiding them with the same strength she had found during her darkest days. Her journey had given her a deep empathy, and she dedicated her time to building a safe, supportive network for others who faced struggles like hers. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch watching her children play, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. She knew that the past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had built something beautiful from the ashes of her fear, a life filled with love, resilience, and hope. Samuel ran up to her, grinning as he waved a paper in his hand. "Mom, I got an A on my science project." Grace laughed, pulling him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." As Ella joined them, her laughter ringing out like a melody, Grace felt a profound sense of contentment. They had come so far, had faced so much, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. Years later, Grace's story would continue to be told, passed down through the community as a reminder of the power of courage and resilience. Her legacy inspired others to stand up, to speak out, and to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And as the years went by, her children grew up with the same values, carrying forward the lessons their mother had taught them. They remembered the fear, but they remembered the triumph too, the way she had held them close, had shielded them with her love, had shown them that darkness could be overcome. In the end, Grace's story was one of transformation, a testament to the strength of a mother's love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the power of hope. And though the shadows of the past would always linger, they could never overshadow the light she had brought into the world. As Grace's story reminds us, courage and resilience can change lives, even in the face of overwhelming odds. If you enjoyed this journey, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful, inspiring stories every week. Stay tuned. There's another gripping narrative waiting just for you. Click the links on your screen for more stories full of heart, courage, and hope. Thank you for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you in our next adventure. As Clara looked around the gathering, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace and pride. Her journey from heartbreak to healing had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of so many others who had felt lost and alone. She had found her purpose, her passion, and a community that cherished her. With her story shared, Clara knew her journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more lives to touch, and more stories to tell. But for the first time in her life, she was ready for it all. If Clara's story touched your heart and you'd like to follow more stories of resilience, self-discovery, and healing, please subscribe to our channel. By turning on notifications, you'll never miss a new story that could inspire and uplift you. Join us as we continue exploring real-life journeys that make a difference. Thank you for watching, and click on the next video for another inspiring story. We'll see you there.